This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan Podcast, where this year we're exploring the weekly Haftorah portion. This week's episode is sponsored by Toby and David Kerwin in memory of David's father, Dr. Richard Kerwin, Zichrono Livracha, in honor of his upcoming yahrzeit. His pioneering work in education, rooted in dignity and hope, shaped generations of students and teachers and continues to influence classrooms around the world. For those of you who listen weekly, sponsoring an episode can be a great way to honor a memory, a friend, and even mark a momentous occasion. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. Parshat Vayigash opens with Yehuda's moving speech to Yosef that ultimately breaks down the smokescreen separating Yosef from his brothers. After the big reveal, Paro invites Yosef's family to come live in Egypt, and Yaakov embarks yet again on a migration, this time out of Canaan. He is so concerned, it seems, that God reveals himself, a sole occurrence of revelation in this entire episode, and promises Yaakov that the story will end well and that he will produce a great nation in Egypt. The Parsha also tells of Yosef's agrarian policies through which he turns the Egyptian citizens into tenant farmers of the state. The Egyptian people directly request of Yosef that they become slaves to the state so that they can survive. There is some irony in this interaction where Yosef, who was once sold as a slave, legally and willingly enslaves the Egyptian population. This also perhaps foreshadows the future era of slavery. This week's Haftorah is read from Yechezkel, Perek Lamed Zayin, Tetvav Tu Kafchet, 37:15-28. It's the second half of a chapter which recounts a vision of grafting two branches together, representing the two kingdoms of Israel. The first 33 chapters of Yechezkel focus on the incumbent destruction and prophecies of doom to the surrounding nations. And in chapter 33, the news of the destruction of the Beit Mikdash reaches Yechezkel. Chapters 34 and onward, including our vision from the Haftorah, are prophecies of redemption and hope. To unpack this vision, I'm so happy to have back on the podcast Rabbanit Shani Taragin. Hi, Shani.
Hello. Wonderful to be here.
Shani Taragin is the Educational Director of Matan's Eshkelot Tanakh Teachers Professional Development Program and Educational Director of Mizrahi Lapidot Advanced Torah Learning for Women and the new Mizrahi Nefesh Benefesh Tzemach David Benot Sherut Program. And she's also the Rosh Beit Midrash of Yeshiva University in Israel Women's Division and has been teaching in Matan for 33 years. Rabbanit Shani Taragin has directed, taught, and continues to teach and lead Tanakh tours and coordinate programs in numerous seminaries and adult education programs in Israel and worldwide. I'm really happy to be here with you for this episode.
I am thrilled to be here with you.
I remember the last time we spoke about Birkat Kohanim. I remember that was the episode. And we're here today to jump into the book of Yechezkel. Now, what is really great about this new series on Haftorah is that we have the opportunity to delve into Nevi'im that we really have never spoken about. And the, well over 200 and something episodes we've had on this podcast format, we didn't really mention these books and we didn't have an introduction to them. So maybe we just start really briefly with a little bit about who Yechezkel was as a prophet, and then obviously to dig deeper into the vision that we have, the famous vision in this week's Haftorah.
Yes, well, firstly, from a pedagogic perspective, I'm so happy that you're doing this year because I think it really is a wonderful window for people to explore Nevi'im, particularly Nevi'im Achronim. And Yechezkel, I have to be honest, is one of my favorite by virtue of the fact that we learn so much about Nevuah, about the art of prophecy, from Yechezkel, ironically, because he's the exception to the rule of prophecy. He is the first prophet who is living outside of Israel, from the beginnings, really, of national prophecy. And even though one thinks about Moshe Rabbeinu, again, when we speak about really the idea of a court prophet, of a Navi HaMelech, we're really beginning from the times that Am Yisrael are in the land of Israel. So Yechezkel himself, as a microcosm of the people, is not only depressed, he's in shock, and he also hasn't fully accepted that Am Yisrael as part of the galut, as part of the Harash Masker, the aristocracy of Israel that was exiled already in 597 BCE, 11 years before the destruction, he, together with his population, they're convinced that they're going to return to the land of Israel. And I love the way that Yechezkel begins, Vayi b'shloshim shana. And many of the Parshatim explain it's 30 years from 622 BCE, from the time of the finding of the Sefer Torah. It's 30 years, again, from maybe, as the Radak says, of years of Yovel and Shemitah. It's 30 years, and it really does seem to be the 30th year of a Yovel cycle. But my favorite is the Abarbanel, who says that it's his birthday. It's Hey Tammuz when the Sefer begins, and it's his birthday. And the 30th birthday of a Kohen is when he would go to the Beit HaMikdash to offer his Menchat Chinuch and become a Kohen. And he says, and here I am. I'm by Nahar Kvar. I'm in Bavel. And one of the first prophecies that he's given is that he has to eat tamei food, defiled food. And he's aghast. And Hashem says, no, this is what you have to do. It's almost as if I think about Superman giving up his superpowers. And Yechezkel the Navi is basically relinquishing his status as a Kohen. And then he has to shave off all of his hair. And he himself is really mourning. But what makes him so unique is that Hashem takes him to the Bik'ah, apparently the same dale of Bik'at Bavel, of where Migdal Bavel was built, of where languages were created. And that's where Hashem takes away his power of speech. Can you imagine? A Navi, right, from the word Niv, who is supposed to speak. And God says, no, you're not going to speak. Your job is literally to serve as a pipeline. You are merely that messenger to keep that, that internet line open so that if they want to turn to you, they can turn to you as a means of repenting to Hashem, and also so that you can explain to them that everything that's going on is not just a political setback, but really is divinely inspired. And for his years starting from the 5th year of him in Galut, so that's 592 BCE, until the Churban, as you were saying, until Hashem says, get ready, in chapter 24, Hineni lokech mimchat machmane nacha, his own wife has to die as a precursor for the destruction of the apple of his eye, of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And then for all these years, he's a mute Navi. What that means is literally, I picture him like a Woody doll, that he only speaks when Hashem tells him to speak, and he has to say exactly the words that Hashem tells him, and literally follow stage directions. He's told, clap your hands, claps, right? Literally serve as a microcosm for everything that's going to happen to Am Yisrael. He has to act out the siege and the destruction. And then, only when he hears about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, as you said in chapter 33, then Hashem says, when the palit comes, when the refugee comes to tell you about the destruction of Yerushalayim, then hineni potech et picha, then you can open up your mouth and deliver the messages of nechama, of consolation, which our Haftorah this week is part of the chapters, and not just of the written chapters, but the chapter of Yechezkel's life, where he can open up and express himself with encouraging Am Yisrael, with speaking about the future trajectory of return to Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, no, that's an important sort of sketch of who he was, or the trials and difficulties that God puts him through. And there's this very important overlap, both in time and also in this portrait of what a prophet is between him and Yirmiyahu, right? They overlap in time as well. They're prophesying they have an overlapping period of time, although, as you said, he's already in Bavel, and Yirmiyahu is going to be in Yerushalayim until he then goes down to Egypt. But they both become these prophets who, as you said, are really expressive about what they're experiencing and the difficulty of their job. And also, I would say both raise really hard questions about what it means to be a messenger of God, meaning they're put through a tremendous amount of misery. And it doesn't seem like a job that someone would be particularly interested in having based on the way that their life functions. So I think that just seeing them both also sort of refracted through a similar time period, through the destruction, and also that the tenor of what their life becomes when it's wrapped up in their mission to be part of this period of destruction is very painful, but it's just, I think, also important to note that they're part of the same time period.
100%. And it's interesting what you said. I always tell my students, I'm a little bit of a Navi wannabe until you learn Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel.
Yeah, and then part ways.
Exactly. But it's also interesting that albeit they're in different geographic zones, and even though Yirmiyahu begins to prophesy before Yechezkel, which means that Yechezkel knew of Yirmiyahu, they offer very different messages to their respective populations by virtue of their different, not only, the demographic, but literally the zeitgeist of the time. So Yirmiyahu is talking about the potential for return in Yerushalayim. He doesn't give up on the people and is trying to elicit from them some response of tshuva, of change. Whereas Yechezkel, who finds himself with aristocracy in Babylonia, even before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, he has to convince them that this is it. Can you imagine? They're hearing from their cousins in Yerushalayim, no, shalom, shalom, that it's still Heichal Hashem, they still have the Beit HaMikdash. And here you have, for the first time, really two distinct populations. The population in Eretz Yisrael, a population in Babel, the ones in the diaspora, who think that, okay, they're meant to return to the land of Israel, that their cousins in Eretz Yisrael are the lucky ones. And can you imagine a prophet who has to get up and say, no, the ones in the land of Israel are going to be destroyed. They're content with the status quo. They think that everything is okay. Whereas you, the ones who are in Chutz La'aretz, you have a better chance of returning. You're the ones who recognize that you're not where you should be. And therefore, you're going to be the ones who really are going to chart the future for Am Yisrael.
Another piece I think that comes through really importantly through the work of Yechezkel is this idea of the function or what we can gain through an exilic process.
100%.
Right? Meaning Yirmiyahu is this prophet who basically says, please don't leave Yerushalayim, right? And even when there's this Gedaliah there, and don't kill him and stay, and he's very against them going down to Egypt, also because it's Egypt, but also because it's leaving Israel. And Yechezkel is he's planting those seeds for what it's going to mean to return. And so like that split screen, each of them has a very different focus. I think also, by the way, and we'll get to this, I think it becomes an interesting question, what we're supposed to take l'dorot from those ideas, right?
Yes.
Is it the staying or is it the leaving?
Exactly.
And it's this first time in history that we have this here. And I think that very often, Dafka, Yirmiyahu, and Yechezkel, I really understand the nivuah tzorcha l'dorot, right? That we needed these prophecies for the long run, and that's why they're written down. I understand that truth much more about Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel than, let's say, I do on Yeshayahu even.
Yes.
Because there's something in Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, again, because of the last century that we've lived through, that these questions of different spheres of influence, being inside, being outside, what's planting seeds for the future, what's trying to preserve what exists now, I think that those ideas are just, they're always important, but they become much more critical in the past century.
Yes, I wish the listeners could see me smiling because I think that these Svarim are so relevant today, even though we generally turn to the prophets of Shabbat Zion, of the return to Zion, because we are facing very similar phenomena. I think the distinction of two populations obviously resonates today. And I was once sitting in on a class of a teacher teaching Yechezkel, and he said, you see from Yechezkel, especially at the beginning, the Shekhinah leaves Yerushalayim and is in Babel. And just as you said, there are really changes that take place and messages that the Jews outside of Eretz Yisrael are supposed to learn and appreciate from their years in exile. And then he ended the class by saying, and here's proof to the fact that God is still in exile with us, and therefore we should all be staying here in exile. And I remember, yes, indeed, and thinking, wait, you didn't learn the second half of Yechezkel, and one has to realize that Yechezkel is not speaking about, and the beginning of Yechezkel, about the eternal fate of Am Yisrael, but God is really with us. Imo anochi bat Sarah, the Shekhinah does leave, and it's the only time really in Jewish history where a prophet has to state that I witnessed the Shekhinah leaving. He describes what we know as Maseh Merkabah, and this divine theophany in order to corroborate that, yes, kind of the Shekhinah is leaving, but then he describes how the Shekhinah is going to return. And important for a population in the diaspora to know that there is, as you said, a goal in exilic Jewry. There is a goal in this time period, but it really is all to prepare us for returning to Zion.
Okay, so I think that's a really important groundwork that we've laid to understand a little bit about Yechezkel. And you already mentioned the word bik'ah. This week's Haftorah it lists the second half of the parak, and it lists it very clearly because we have here. I use the word grafting, and I'll see if you give a different definition, but sort of the joining of some sort of branch that is representing the southern kingdom or Yehuda, and a branch that's representing the northern kingdom of Yosef, which the connection to the Parsha, right, is obvious. Okay, yes. But I definitely will go deeper on that. But before we read that section, which is our Haftorah, we have the famous vision of the dry bones.
Yes. So it's remarkable about our Haftorah is that it's framed by two beautiful eschatological visions. As you said, the dry bones that we read as the Haftorah for over Chol Hamoed Pesach, and then the one right after, which we read as the Haftorah, Gog Magog, the eschatological, literally the war to end all wars against all of our enemies, which we read as Haftorah and Chol Hamoed Sukkot. So at this week's Haftorah, really I want to say is, the most perhaps energetic and momentous in the sense that that you're speaking about what is essential as part of the process of Yemot HaMashiach, HaGeula.
And the one interpretation of those bones, I think I'm actually quoting Rav Yoel Benyon on this, is the idea that the resurrection of those bones is the northern kingdom, meaning that is the northern kingdom that's being resurrected in there. And then we can go on to the second part of the prophecy, which talks about joining the kingdoms. I'm curious how you look at the first part of that.
Yeah, so I actually see it as the Gemara in Sanhedrin explains. It can be understood literally, which means either the northern kingdom that was not only killed, but really exiled by the Assyrians starting the years of 780 through, again, 705 BCE. But I even prefer, and then there are others like Rav Yehuda who says it's not the northern kingdom, it's Bnei Ephraim who left Egypt early. But I prefer the metaphoric, really the figurative explanation, which is that he's speaking to his population. He's speaking to the dry bones. He's speaking to a post, one can even say Shoah, really a post-Holocaust generation where
Yechezkel is speaking to the people in front of him.
Exactly. Okay. And he knows that these are people who themselves, for the first time in nearly 900 years, they've been banished from their homelands. They have witnessed destruction. They have lost family members. They have been oppressed by the Babylonians. They are no longer an autonomous people. Can you imagine? 900 years. Here we're celebrating 77, and we feel that the events of the past 2 years threatens our existence. 900 years. And this is a reality that they're really having a difficult time absorbing and processing. And Hashem comes to him in that bik'ah, the same bik'ah, where he became a Navi. And Hashem commands of him, or basically asks him rhetorically, what do you think, Yechezkel? Right? You as a member of this generation. And Yechezkel innocently says, Hashem, atayadata. I don't know. Isn't it in your hands? You know? And what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is imploring of Yechezkel is, you have to do something. You have to infuse your generation with inspiration. You have to tell them that there's hope. And sure enough, he says, Hinaveh ala tamot ha'eleh. I don't know, Yechezkel, it's not up to me, it's up to you. What are you going to tell them to revive their spirit? And Yechezkel says in the name of Hashem, Hinei ani mevi bachem ruach v'chiyitem. Come on. Again, yes, you are going to live again. You are going to continue. You are going to have a future. And we see something remarkable in the Haftorah, which is why I'm so happy that we're turning back really to what I call the introduction of this week's Haftorah, which is first he sees them with Gidim. He says, Benatati alechem gidim, balite alechem basar, v'karanti alechem or. It's really the scene of, mummies,
it's the first is the physical flesh revival.
Beautiful.
And then there's going to be the ruach.
And then, but what's remarkable, he sees them coming back to life, the ruach ein b'hem. One is that physical revival, right? I think what we're experiencing now, even after 2 years, people getting back to work, people going back to their families, but we know that there's so much post-trauma. We know that Now we have to work on the Ruach. I think every day when I daven Shemona Esrei, Matir Asurim U'Machaye Emunato L'Shenei Afar, that Baruch Hashem, we've seen Hatarat Asirim, we've seen hostages returning, and now it's time La'Chayot Emunah, to bring that faith back, to bring that spirit back. And what's remarkable, he then is told, V'hinabiti kasher tivani v'tavo behem haruach v'yachyu. Again, there's ruach, and then Hashem qualifies and says, this is what's going to happen. Tell them that first I'm going to restore their physical state. And what does that mean? Ve'veti etchem al admat Yisrael. I'm going to return you to the land of Israel. And that's why I think it's so clear, even though, of course, we can see this as the exile of the north, and we can see it as those who were in a valley for hundreds of years who were killed and died, and Hashem reassuring their physical return. I think speaking to a generation that's experienced the first major national destruction in Jewish history, they have to hear this. And then Hashem says, what will happen next? Look at Pasuk Yudalid. It's remarkable. Menatati ruchi bachem v'chiyitem. When will you have that ruach? V'inachti etchem al admatchem. Only once I bring you back to your land. He basically is telling Yechezkel, there's so much you can do in exile. You can restore the people. They can understand material worth. You look at our 2,000 years of exile and you see remarkable works, really works of the spirit also. You see the works of Rashi, the commentaries of medieval exegetical commentators. You see the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. You see the golden age of Spain. But that ruach isn't fully restored until we're back here. And then something happens. And that's the prelude. Notice that it's not even a Parshiya Ptucha. It's a Parshiya Stuma. It's a closed unit. That's the prelude to this week's Haftorah, which is Achdut. First, you have to come back here. First, you need that spirit. First, you need literally that Machayem Meitim, but with Emunah and Ruach.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so exciting, because I think that this is where we are right now, historically, as a Jewish people. We're on the crux of the next stage, which is finally Achdut.
I think if I could just, let's pull apart the obvious nimshal in what you're saying here, which is that we could look at the past 2 years and say that we had, the physical absence of people, and then the physical return, and then their ruach. But I think, many have said about this parak and looked at it dafka as something that felt so relevant in our time. And as you said, hinted to before, looked at the dry bones as, Eastern European Jewry and the Holocaust, and then coming to Israel. Or I would even say that the state of Israel was first mostly established by people of flesh, meaning by a vision that I wouldn't say is lacking ruach, but it wasn't a ruach of emunah. It was a ruach of socialism, it was a ruach of all different, of nationalism and different movements that galvanized people to be here. And that's a stage of the Or V'Gidim, right? Of the physical, I would say the creation, which obviously the creation of the state had to be much more than physical. There had to be a lot of ideas that push people to want to do this. But we can maybe generally call it the creation of the physical body. And then I would say for many decades now, right, we've really been trying to figure out the quagmire of what is the ruach of this place, meaning what is the character of Israel? What is the combined... Again, in Hebrew we say ruach all the time. We use that word, but it doesn't. Spirit sounds Christian, so it's hard for me to use that word in English. But to try and figure out what is the character of Israel, what is in the atmosphere here, what do we want it to be? And I think that we are mostly in that stage now already for decades of this question of what is the ruach. And I think that we've seen like a microcosm of the physical and the ruach in the past 2 years, but it's kind of in the midst of something much bigger that's been going on for over a century at this point.
100%. I think specifically for Am Yisrael and within Yechezkel, where he plays off of the Tzemen Mila Mancha. Very often, these two words that go together, that we see in Bahalotcha as well, that we see actually in the Haftorah of Shabbat Chanukah of this week from Zechariah 2, of the Basar and the Ruach.
Yeah.
Le Basar and Le Ruach, of just as you said, the physical and the spiritual. And that's Am Yisrael, right? We have not just in the simplistic term of, yes, we have our spiritual side and obviously our very physical and materialistic, but in the creation of a state, in the formation of a people and the restoration of autonomy. These are significant issues. It's not just basic survival, which one can argue those are, the military branches, but the political, the social, the religious zeitgeist, that's the Ruach.
And by the way, there's I think, tell me if you agree, a great reference here to Gan Eden. Because God says, I'm going to give you Ruach, which is obviously reminiscent of like Hashem giving Ruach, right? And then V'hinachti etchem al admatchem. Now again, we have this famous question, is Gan Eden Israel, is it not Israel? But here you clearly have Yechezkel being dorish that idea, because we were Vayinichehu, right? God places man in Gan Eden, and here it's saying God will place you. It'll almost be on the plane, on a plane. You'll get there on a plane and you'll just touch down, right? It sounds very free of conflict, which, obviously history played out a little bit differently. But I think that idea here is, there's literally like a recreation of humanity.
Yes, and definitely the ensuing chapters of Yechezkel, when he's taken to see the dimensions of the forthcoming Beit HaMikdash, which Herod, by the way, used as part of the blueprints for his construction. You definitely see numerous allusions to Gan Eden.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't we just, in our time left, why don't we just go a little bit deeper into the vision from our Haftorah?
Yes, this week's Haftorah.
So as you said beautifully, this is the Achdut, meaning we have to physically create, we have to physically get here. We're coming here with Ruach that's coming with us from elsewhere, but it's being completed by actually being here in Israel. Yes. And then now it comes time for the really hard work that we've obviously been digging our teeth into for the past few years of trying to actually figure out how to live together. Yes. At the backdrop of this, but I just want to remind our listeners that the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel were at war with each other throughout many periods of the monarchy. Certainly in the post-Rechavam stage, meaning a few generations after Shlomo, and more than that, we have many moments where the northern and southern kingdoms, they really treat each other not like brothers, meaning also politically, that wasn't their view of each other. They didn't see themselves as deeply rooted in the same place. They really developed different character, different sense. You had the Mikdash and the much smaller and politically weaker southern kingdom of Judah, and you had the much stronger but much farther astray from the emunot of Am Yisrael in the northern kingdom, but much stronger, much more powerful, bigger players on the world stage. And so this vision isn't just relevant now, meaning people then did not look at them as their brother kingdom in the way that we like to think about when we think about Tanakh, because we kind of look back and think about it nostalgically.
Exactly. For over 300 years, as you said, starting from Piluk HaMelucha, the separation of the kingdoms, with Yeravim ben Nevat especially placing barriers even, so that the people from the northern kingdom wouldn't even get to Yerushalayim and to the Beit HaMikdash. And that's why this is so significant after not just 300 years of separation, rivalry, literally wars. The last of the wars was when the king of Yehuda, when Achaz is going to ally with the Assyrians to attack Aram and Pekach ben Remaliah, the king of Israel. Yes. So definitely very deep-seated and rooted conflict and tension here. And also to think that, as we know, that it was only about 120 years before Yechezkel that the people of Yehuda witnessed the exile, the Assyrian exile of the northern kingdom. So for Yechezkel to come back at this time, when they're still in exile, and say, stage number 1, you're going to return, right? Either, as we just discussed, figuratively or physically, literally, you're going to return to Eretz Yisrael. And then that's why it's so essential to place this Haftorah in its proper context. The next stage is Achdut. I always say when people talk about all the civil rifts in Eretz Yisrael, our vociferous society, I say, don't worry. First, we have to get through the first half of Perek Lamed Zayin. Yeah. And this is, as Yechezkel says, the final challenge that leads to literally the last stages of complete sovereignty. So we really are two separate kingdoms, as you said. And that's why he's told to take these two eitzim, right? So you said also, some people see them as two wooden sticks, but I agree. Really, Rav Yehuda Shaviv says also, it's clear that one is being grafted on the other. Yeah. So the question is,
what's the center?
What's the center?
Yeah, what's the root? Yeah.
Right? And because we know that once you graft, so basically the fruit
one becomes
resembles
dominant.
Correct. So take a look. You tell me, what do you think? Which one is being grafted on who's being grafted on whom.
Okay, well, I will say that the end point is it says v'hayu la'achadim biyadecha, which means that they will be one. But in terms of what they're placing on each other, it says take first the Yehuda, right, that one, and then also take the Etz Yosef.
Yes.
And it just says v'karav otam echad el echad. I don't know. I'm not sure that any of them are supposed to be dominant.
So it's interesting when you graft. So there's that tree, and then you have to add on to it. So the fact that there is Yehuda and Yosef Chaverav, and I love how you noted that there are two different stages. One is v'karov otam echad el echad. Firstly, they're still in plural. Did you notice? They're still achadim. In other words, the first stage, they still retain their own individual identities. Yeah. That's right. And then when he has to explain, Hineni lokech et eitz Yosef asher biad Ephraim b'shiftei Yisrael chaverav. It seems that the base is actually Yosef.
Yeah, and then he puts on them alav et Yehuda,
which is so reminiscent of this week's Parsha.
Yeah,
meaning we see Yosef emerging as a leader before Yehuda. We see character traits of leadership already from Parshat Vayigash. You know, definitely Yehuda saying Ma betakina rogat achinu, Yehuda the one to say Tatka mimeni, Yehuda the one to say Anochi arvenu miadi tebakshenu. Again, that's Yehuda, but still Yosef is the one who's firstly rooted, and then you're going to graft Yehuda onto Yosef. And Yechezkel is giving so much hope, because one could perhaps extrapolate from this nevuah that even if Yosef isn't physically there, even if the 10 tribes don't return, that's okay. The basis is actually Yosef, but Yehuda, you're the future. You're the graft. And then your identities are going to be merged. But this is what's remarkable. When you graft, so the new fruit actually resembles the grafted component, and it's healthier and it's stronger. And that's exactly what is going to happen. The new fruit is going to be Malchut Yehuda, which is not only the emergence that we already see in Parshat Vayigash, but really the continuity of the promises that Hashem had offered Beit David, which then will be the completion of the Mikdash as well. And what is beautiful is not only to try to figure out who is the eitz and who is the grafted, but the Radak questions. He says, how will this be achieved? How are we going to be unified? And I've been quoting this so much, especially over the past years. So the Radak says that they're going to turn, he says they're going to be grafted together through an external force. In other words, we're going to be something's going to happen, and we're going to have to literally graft ourselves together, which I love, because we actually have just experienced that, right? And that's what's going to bring us together, which also, though, invigorates us and implores of us that we have to do something once that external force comes. However, he quotes his father, who says, Al derech nes, which on one hand is beautiful, on the other hand, I always say it's a little bit of a cop-out. Right. He says, no, the only way that the two of us are going to get together is through a miracle. And I wonder, after the past 2 years, I think I look at this Haftorah a little differently. Is it that, okay, we realize that we have to graft ourselves together because we're much stronger, we're much healthier. If we want our children, the next generation, to be healthier, then we have to be responsible for that grafting, even if it was because of an external force that literally weakened us? Or do we have to wait for a miracle? Or maybe what we experienced really was that miracle.
Right. Yeah, the question of how you define miracle, I think, is is the key to this piece. Yes. I think also, though, if I can, by force, connect the first part of the bones and this vision, which is you might even look at the Yosef branch, which, as we said, is the base branch, as the Or Vigidim, meaning they're perhaps, I don't know, maybe it's a physical revival, and then you put on it, Yehuda, which is representing something different in the eyes of the prophet, meaning that might be another connection between them. There are these two stages there, and then there's two branches here. I don't know. I think obviously it's dangerous also to think about importing that metaphor. Who is it that's coming and bringing the Ruach? Who's the one that's responsible to be Yehuda, essentially? in today's world. But I just thought about that also as we're learning this together.
That's beautiful. And I think you definitely can incorporate the two different dimensions of leadership, because Rav Kook does speak about it, but he speaks about it as, just as you said, as the ruach, meaning it's not the first stage of the Atzamot Yeveshot coming back to life. It's once we're back in Israel, how is the ruach restored? It's restored through Achdut, and the base, in fact, is Yosef. And he beautifully describes this in a very famous hesped on July 20th, 1903. It was Gimel Tammuz. And this is when, July 3rd, 1904, again, on the 20th of Tammuz, we know that Theodor Herzl died at the age of 44. And the government at the time, the secular government, approached Rav Kook, the religious leader of the country, and asked him to eulogize Theodor Herzl. And he was put in this very precarious situation because you can imagine the religious supporter.
Dan if you don't.
That's exactly
it.
The
old Yeshuv didn't like him anyways, and now he's going to give a hesped for the
secular Jew.
Exactly.
What is he going to do? So he brilliantly, without ever once mentioning Herzl's name, he brilliantly
called hesped Yerushalayim. Anyone who
hesped gadol Yerushalayim, really remarkable. And he spoke about this Haftorah, meaning this Nivuah of Yechezkel. And he said, here we see that we need both. We need Yosef and we need Yehuda. We need, and he quotes from the Gemara and Sanhedrin and Chagiga about the Levaya of Hadad Ramon, which is greater than the funeral of Yoshiyahu, the king who allowed for religious reform. And Chazal explain that who's Hadad Ramon? It's Achav, notorious Achav, who allowed for the nationalization of idolatry, but at the same time unified Am Yisrael and took us to the next level with regard to military might and power in the ancient Middle East. And he says that that's Yosef. That Yosef that you see from Parshat Vayigash, Yosef is the dreamer, but also very much the material one, right? Really, he says, the practical one, right? He's the one who knows how to enable the survival of his brethren in Egypt. He's the one to come up with a plan of, the years of plenty, maximizing them, just as you began with how to even transform all of Egypt for survival by taking the citizens and really turning it into a feudalistic state. Really remarkable. He says that's the power of Yosef. And what he does is he alludes to the beginnings of the formation of the state due to the secular Zionists, who are the ones who, like Yosef, basically provided for the backbone, the practical backbone, the economic backbone, the military backbone of the country.
And he highlights also this midrashic idea about Mashiach ben Yosef, which is something that doesn't have a lot of prominence. And I think it's really Rav Kook. I mean, I've researched the topic once when I was teaching Yosef, the Yosef stories, but it really gains prominence in our modern consciousness because of this hesped that Rav Kook, which, by the way, he was hated on from both sides.
Yes.
It was not well received, although in the religious Zionist rhetoric, we have really taken this as a very as a formative kind of way of speaking and a way of looking at the world. But when he said it then, I just finished a biography of Rav Kook also, so I'm was remembering the politics around this. Great book, Yehuda Mirsky, Jewish Live series, great book. And but I think that this is something that is in many people's consciousness, even if they never heard it quoted from Rav Kook, but it's gotten around in the over 100 years since it was said.
And I think that even though he was attempting to straddle both sides, what he wanted to project and really to encourage beyond unity was really a sense of understanding the gradual development of the Jewish people. That just as in the anti-slavery,
and that was radical from a religious perspective.
That's right.
Yes.
To see that it can start with the secular, because he himself speaks about in other places the ideal of starting with that ruach, starting with a more religious state, which is the old yeshuv, and coming and attempting initially to really strengthen the religious population. But then he says it's okay, you don't have to look at the state as de facto. Isn't that remarkable? You can look at it as lechatchila, that maybe this is the way it was meant to be. It was meant to start with Yosef. It was meant to start with that somewhat more secular nature the pragmatic. We needed, basically what he's saying is we needed an Achav. We needed a pseudo Herzl, right? That's what he's alluding to. We needed that in order to get us off the ground, to get the state started. That's the eights. But don't worry. What he's also doing is not only encouraging, he really is imploring Yehuda, all of you religious Zionists now, time to graft yourselves onto the state, time for you to serve in the army, time for you to infuse the government with that ruach, with that spirit. And he understands that Yehuda, and we see it in this week's Parsha, he really does represent the future and the religious future. And this isn't just alluded to with Vayigash elav Yehuda. It's also, as we know, by the end of the Parsha, Vayishlach Yehuda lefanav, that Yaakov sends Yehuda to Mitzrayim, and Chazal tell us to set up Batei Midrash, and Batei, basically yeshivot, that he understands, okay, we're living in a secular government, but we need more yeshivot and midrashot. We need more spirit. And that's, if you think about this is over 120 years ago, and we're still working, I think, on grafting more of a religious framework onto a pre-existing secular one.
Totally. And I think that this idea of that we're somewhere in between these visions right now, like, is very much the sense we have, both in the sense that quote unquote secular Israel has become more ruach, not in the halachic sense, but that's something that has so much press, in the past few months particularly.
Yosef, isn't that exciting? I'm sorry for interrupting. I just, even as you're saying it, to realize that
we're in our Haftorah right now. We're somewhere in that space of figuring out how to combine those pieces together. Agreed. I think the first part, it came true in our lives, and I think that it's a struggle to be stuck in the middle of something, because it's sometimes hard to get a sense of the trajectory, especially when there's setbacks along that way. But I think that it's very much the felt sense that we're somewhere in this week's Haftorah in our world today. And I think that for anyone listening who maybe knows these texts but doesn't identify necessarily with the way we personified the figures, right? Because we've offered multiple prisms of how one can look at it. The secular state of Israel, and then the religious coming, or, the today, maybe the Tati Lumi world, or, right? We've offered a lot of different interpretations that exist, right, in the world of Parshanut, and understanding how this prophecy relates to us now. I think even the most basic common ground, or the common factor between all those ideas, is that whatever we're going to do here is going to have to be a combination of multiple foundations. Meaning there may be at some point one element that sort of rises above the others, and I guess we'll wait to see what that is and how that happens. But I think that at its base, this Haftorah tells us that we need both of these pieces, whatever those both are. However anybody understands that in their own life and in their own metaphors and importance to their life, there is something that is innately complex, not in the sense that it's not clear, but that it has to be a combination of multiple factors to it. It's a danger to think that there's something one-dimensional about creating something as complex as Am Yisrael. There always were multiple mothers, there always were multiple children, there always were multiple factions, and whatever we're able to do, hopefully in the, as you said, the unity stage, is going to be something that's going to have to be a combination of all those factors.
As you're speaking, I'm literally picturing the Parsha and the Haftarah, meaning such a beautiful, beautiful Parsha where you can imagine Vayigash elav Yehuda approaching Yosef with trepidation, and ultimately it ending in an embrace, meaning Yehuda is coming towards Yosef on one hand with submission, but if you look carefully and you listen to his words, he comes really with confidence, and then they end in an embrace. And then you think of this beautiful, beautiful imagery of grafting. We know that the Haftorah is always not simply a resonance of the Parsha, but a commentary. It's Parshanut, and it's telling you that an embrace, as we know, unfortunately, they also separated eventually into two different kingdoms, but here they're going to be grafted together. That embrace is going to be an eternal one. Mm-hmm. And just as you said, how the dynamics exactly, how the xylem and phloem are going to work, and which nutrients are going to come, who's going to infuse whom with what, is it going to happen miraculously? Are we going to be able to figure out how to do this on our own? These are still the questions yet to be answered. But the beautiful promise of Vavdi David Melech Alehem V'roeh Echad Yeh Lechulam V'mishpati Elechu V'chukotai Yishmaru V'asu Otam, each one still perhaps with their own flavor and with their own individuality, and certainly not uniformity, right? There isn't uniformity at the end. It's still the tree that allows for different produce, for different types of fruit. But it's so beautiful that in the end, v'yashbu ala ha'aretz asher natati l'avdi liYaakov, asher yeshbu ba'avotechem, v'yashbu ala ha'hema uvneihem uvnei bneihem ad olam, v'David avdi nasi lahem la'olam. That in the end, as opposed to that temporary achdut that they had in Egypt, this is an eternal one. That we're going to have be'eretz mugorei aviv. We're going to have this in the land of Yaakov, in Yisrael. So complex it is. And the psukim that ends with a brit shalom, this is obviously our tefillah. And I certainly hope that we're going to be able, as the Radak says, to figure it out and to allow for those beautiful fruit to grow. And on one hand, I'm a little impatient every once in a while. And then I think of this Haftorah, of the stages of grafting, and realize that it starts with small blossoms, and we know that we don't see the fruit right away. And even the first fruit that come are not as strong as the ones that come the season thereafter. So I don't want to just say, let's wait and see. Say, let's continue to graft. Let's make sure that that hug is really one that remains an eternal bond.
Rabbanit Shani Taragin, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.